We'll
Awesome.
record.
Okay, I have to go to a Cub Scout meeting.
Excellent.
Bye, everybody.
Hi.
Bye-bye. Hi, Brad and Maki and Robin. We're going to give everybody 1 more minute and then we're going to start.
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
We're
Hi, Ed. Hi, Sandra.
waiting to hear about
Our future.
the entrance fee for non-native.
Well, there is one text that will actually give you an answer.
Really? Okay.
Can we afford it?
You can.
No, good.
Hi, Judy. Hi, Paula.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Apologize.
Barbara and Ken are in the process of joining.
Okay. Okay, and everybody has a little notebook to write down reflective questions.
Well, you want to write down?
Okay. It is 7:02. We're going to start. Let's say our bracha for studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. So I got to teach the part of everything you wished you learned in Hebrew school that has to do with beliefs. What do we believe about ourselves as our humans? What do we believe about God? And I have to say, today's may be the most difficult one. What do we believe about the afterlife? Because in some ways, it's such an intuitive thing. You know, you either kind of have this intuitive sense of, I believe there's something afterwards, or you have this intuitive sense of, I really don't. For those of you who don't, you're actually going to find the text interesting, not because they're going to say you have to believe, but because they're willing to do something really risky, which is use the concept of afterlife and world to come as a way to prod you to behavior in this world. And so one of the interesting things, just when Phyllis came on, she said that, you know, when she had a loss in her life, she really started to think about what happens afterwards. And she started to study. And she hadn't read before that Judaism believes in afterlife. And I would imagine that for many of us, we were told Judaism is about this world, and it is. But at the same time, Judaism also has a really interesting sense of afterlife, which one has deep roots in history, two has evolved and changed over time, and three, which I know is hard, it often will accept extraordinarily contradictory points of view at the same time, which for me says there's utter uncertainty. So my first statement in introducing this is that I approach it with extraordinary humility, because it's just not clear what's going to happen. It's just not clear. And Judaism does not a doctrine. A lot of different thoughts. And my hope tonight is to expose you to the variety of thoughts, the history and development of the ideas, the historic inputs that resulted in different doctrines. I will share with you, and I've tried in every class to be very, very personal in terms of this is what I believe about this. I used to be one of those people who said, I just don't think anything happens. You die and that's it. You go back to the ground from where you came. I don't know about any kind of reward or punishment that felt to me like people who were trying to deal with their own fear about things ending. And it also felt like it could be a very dangerous topic because you start to focus on the afterlife as opposed to this life. And I just had a sense of, I don't think I believe it. But I have to share with you, for reasons that I can't quantify, other than maybe hearing people who've had a deep sense of belief in something afterwards, that I've shifted my viewpoint on this. That I believe very deeply that there's something after this world. I certainly will not be able to prove it to you. I've also had a lot of discussions at the most vulnerable of times, at people at the end of life. And it may well be that hearing some people's thoughts has impacted mine. Is this a reflection of psychological need? I don't know. But I will share with you that for me, it's a very deep-seated viewpoint that just feels rooted in my kishkas. Feel like there's something beyond. I feel like there's something beyond. I also wanted to say before we started that this topic, if we do it right, requires some vulnerability because it means confronting mortality. Thinking about a hard question of how do I face death? And that's uncomfortable. So I wanted to acknowledge the discomfort that the question requires, that the question demands. And again, do it with much humility. And with that, I'm going to jump in to texts. I'm going to share the screen, which means I can't see you all. You will see that I have a lot of material. I have a semester worth of text. And I actually want to go through them because what I want you to do is emerge today with a sense of the history of this, the evolution of it, the breadths of point of view about it. So when we begin in the Bible, there will be points, by the way, where I'll stop share and ask some questions. If there's a burning question along the way, you can hit me in the chat and I'll see it, or you can do a raise hand icon as well. In the book of Genesis, we read that dust you are and to dust you shall return. So if you're taking notes, what does it mean to say we return to dust? Does that mean that are we just talking about the body, which you could argue, or does that mean it's just done? You return from where you came because your life is over. And many people would say, what do I believe about the afterlife? I believe that when this world is done, you're buried and life is over. And often people will look at that particular verse in terms of supporting that point of view. Returning to the ground is, my existence is done. I'm going back to where I came from. And so the sense of finality, I came into the world with nothing, I leave the world with nothing. And a very profound Jewish point of view regarding this is life simply ends, and we try to create heaven on earth through how we behave. So that is a particular place on the spectrum. With every one of the patriarchs, we have an interesting line. It says that they died, and in this case, it was he, Abraham, at a good old age, contented. He was gathered to his kin. I want to know what's meant by gathered to his kin. By the way, someone can even chat me a thought of what that means in terms of our question, what happens after I die? Is there a sense of I am somehow reunited with kin. By the way, this could simply mean I'm buried in the same place they are buried. So every single text, which is often used to show, oh, look what we believe in, can be read in many, many, many different ways. But the sense of gathered to kin might very possibly imply that sense of I'm reunited. And many people who I talk to about end of life will say with real conviction, I feel as if I will be reunited with my loved ones. And you might be able to point to this text, to it says the same thing with Isaac, the same thing with Jacob, the same thing with Moses, the same thing with Aaron, the same thing with Solomon. They were gathered to their kin. So your question here is, what does it mean to be gathered to my kin? How does that apply to me? How does that affect me? There is very little mention in Torah of what happens after you die. All there is a reference to this concept of Sheol. Sheol. I don't know if you've heard of that word before. Sheol. And it's a word whose etymology is unclear. It could mean to call. In modern Hebrew, to ask is lish'ol. And the sense of this is a place of inquiry. That's an interesting way to translate the place where you would go after you die. The place of inquiry. We're unsure what it means. It may also come from Shin Ayin as opposed to Shin Aleph Lamed, Sha'ul, which means hollow. You go to that hollow place, the place of emptiness, the place of nothingness. In every reference in the Torah to Sheol, it is not a place of punishment. It's just the place where the dead reside. And it's important to note that even in Torah, there's a concept of something after this world. So when people say, oh, Judaism doesn't believe in the afterlife, that's really, really untrue. That going back to Torah, there's a concept of something. It's neither good nor bad. In every reference in the Torah, it doesn't say, and I will get my reward in Sheol, or I will be with God in Sheol, or I will, be feasting on delicacies in Sheol. You don't read any description of what it is. And we don't read God connected to Sheol in any of the references. So might it be this place that's beyond the care and the control of God? Now, the concept evolves. And in later literature, in prophetic literature, in wisdom literature, in the Psalms, we see Sheol as a negative place. And what I want to do is walk you through those texts so that you can see how the concept evolved and reflect on why that might happen. So the italics here is summarizing the concept. Later, an additional aspect of individual punishment based on deeds during lifetime was added into what Sheol is. The first reference to Sheol is, I'm sorry, I caught an error. I'm so glad I did not send this to you. It's Jacob to Judah. And do you remember when they were down in Egypt and Joseph, who they don't yet know is Joseph seemingly, says, don't come back unless you have your brother Benjamin. They go back home. The famine gets really bad. They say to their dad, Jacob, you know what? We need to get Benjamin. We need to bring him. And here's what Jacob says to him. He says, if any harm comes to him on the journey that you're to undertake, you will send me down to Sheol with my white head bowed in grief. So what am I learning about what Sheol is there? It's the place where someone who dies goes. Interestingly enough, every reference to Sheol has the concept of down. Was there a sense of you physically descend? What else could be meant by down? And that's a question that I'm going to ask when I come back to share screen. Why does Sheol have the concept of down? Do we see the beginnings of the Jewish concept that says life is about this world and the next world is a descent on a certain level? So we pay attention to the details to say, what does it teach us? There are a few other references to Sheol in the book of Genesis. The most interesting story about Sheol is in the book of Samuel. Saul and the witch of Endor. Give me a nod if you know this story. It's a weird, weird story. And you might listen to this story and say, you know what? This is really a story about psychological descent of Saul, Saul's projections of his own subconscious, his own wrestling with his own uncertainty and pain. All of that might be true. Put it aside, all of those questions, hold on to the interpretations. And as I read the story, I want you to ask the question, what does this teach me about what happens after you die? The characters are Saul, who is the first king, Samuel, who is the prophet who anointed and then rejected him, was constantly telling him what a terrible person he was. Samuel may also have resented monarchy. I'm seeing lots of chats, and so I want to just check in and see what we've got. Good. People are giving good thoughts. Excellent. I'll come back to those. Listen to this story. Samuel dies. Samuel was the prophet. Saul was the king. The prophet came and told you what God wanted. All of Israel lamented him. He was buried in his own town of Ramah. Samuel had forbidden recourse to ghosts and familiar spirits. It's an important detail. The Philistines mustered and they marched to Shunem and encamped. Saul gathered Israel. They encamped at Gilboa. Some of you may have been to Gilboa. Saul saw the Philistine force. His heart trembled with fear. Note that Saul is defined by his fear here. Saul inquired of the Lord. God did not answer him, either by dreams, umim, that's what's on the breastplate, or the prophets. Then Saul said to his courtiers, find me a woman who consults with ghosts so I can go to her and inquire through her. He's desperate. He doesn't know what to do. His courtiers told him there was a woman in Endor. By the way, any of you who watched the show Bewitched knows that the name was Endora, from Endor, who consulted ghosts. Saul disguised himself. He put on different clothes and set out with two men. They came to the woman by night, and he said, divine for me by a ghost. Bring up for me the one I shall name for you. The woman answered him, you know what Saul has done. He banned the use of ghosts and familiar spirits in the land. Why are you laying a trap for me to get killed? Saul swore by the Lord, as the Lord lives, you won't get into trouble over this. The woman asked, who shall I bring up? He answered, bring up Samuel for me. The woman recognized Samuel. In other words, she brings him up. She shrieks. She says to Saul, why do you deceive me? Are you Saul? In other words, only Saul would bring up Samuel. The king answered, don't be afraid. What do you see? The woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up from the earth. That is an interesting statement in terms of we call that person coming up from the earth a divine being. Does someone who died take on a different form? What does he look like? It's an old man. Ooh, he certainly has the same form. He's wrapped in a robe, wearing the same clothes. Then Saul knew it was Samuel. He bowed low in homage with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me and brought me up? Saul answered, I'm in great trouble. The Philistines are attacking me. God's turned away from me. God no longer answers me, either by prophets and dreams. So I've called you to tell me what to do. By the way, it's such a sad scene. Go and read the rest of the scene, because it's an interesting scene. Essentially, Samuel tells him, you know what? You've been disobeying. You'll continue to disobey. You're going to die tomorrow in battle. Okay. What does that text teach us about what happens after life? After death? Let me see a hand or a thought. What does that text teach us? Or a chat? Karen says you could communicate with the dead. By the way, that's an interesting concept. There's a concept here that you can communicate with the dead. By the way, Ruth Shapiro of blessed memory, she's fine with me sharing this because she said it at services, believed that she could communicate with dead relatives. And several of you have shared similar stories. By the way, so Barbara wrote a really interesting comment too. Leave the dead alone. There is a real sense of there's this world and the afterlife, and it's dangerous to mess between the two. The fact that you can doesn't mean you should. And at various times in history, there were kings who said, this is illegal, it's forbidden, don't do it, because maybe they were worried about people getting so caught up in that communication that it would take over their lives. So I actually think that Barbara's comment of, you know what, be careful, leave the dead alone is interesting. Harriet writes, you know, I've had that experience. I think others of you might have that too. And I actually love that a class like this can lift that up. We can be a little vulnerable and say, you know, this is my experience. And reading a religious text that has that opens up that door. There's still form and consciousness, Robin writes. He had the same voice, the same personality, the same clothing. It's a restful place. Leave me alone. So in other words, if it's a don't bother me, it means that I was kind of resting there. You can be haunted by the memory of people who were influential in your life. That may be an interesting psychological read of this story. This is the story about how unresolved pieces in life remain. And every story can be read on so many levels. We're reading it tonight to say, what does it teach us about afterlife? But maybe it's really meant to teach us about unresolved relationships, about how we keep going back to the person who hurt us, how that hurt continues after the grave. And by the way, maybe afterlife is the resolving of all of those unresolved pieces. Rainer wrote, the dead have knowledge of some sort of what's going on with the living. There seems to be a connection between the dead and the living. And so in a second, I'm going to ask you to, and I really want you to write this, what does this text teach you? Because all of these are such interesting answers. Phyllis writes, doesn't Passover have a belief that the Messiah will revive the souls that have died? There are concepts within Judaism where we're going to see about reviving souls. Sometimes it gets linked to the Messiah, sometimes it doesn't. I don't know the specific reference in terms of Passover, so we'll come back to that. Amida says God will resurrect the dead. It absolutely does. So as class goes on, we're going to see where all of these texts build off of these concepts. You build off of these beginning concepts. Maimonides actually says it's one of the 13 principles of faith. You're making going through my long packet much easier because some of those things are all things that we're going to start to see. The world to come is waiting for us. And that might be what Samuel does. Karen asks an interesting question. Do you need someone to call up the dead? The whole thing of there was somebody here who was an expert in it. Or can you do it themselves? Might this have been a story about how Saul was so disconnected from his own spirit and his own sense of godliness that he lost that ability? Might there be people who are skilled in it? Mechayim team, absolutely. This is the beginning of that concept. You know, so Harriet, before class ends, we'll have and who who've helped create those connections. Is Sheol down because down is where you put bodies in terms of where they've been left? That's an interesting question. Why the down? Or is down something that's more symbolic? Ancient fortune telling, which could be a very, very dangerous thing. Roots of trees is another way of looking at down. Excellent. As this synagogue always does, you all bring up great stuff. So next to this text, I want you to write what this concept of Sheol informs you in terms of your concept of afterlife. When we get to the prophets, we start to see an interesting shift in terms of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And the shift is that Sheol becomes a place of punishment. And it's punishment specifically to the nations, often after some terrible national military calamity. It becomes a place of retribution. In the 6th and 7th century BCE, we had numerous defeats. Might religious concepts and beliefs evolve because of what's going on in history? For me, the answer is of course. So Isaiah against the king of Babylon, Sheol below was astir to greet your coming. In other words, they're all ready for you to have died. Rousing for you the shades of all the earth's chieftains, raising from their thrones all the kings of the nations. They all speak up and say, so you've been stricken as we were. In other words, Sheol is now a place where you're stricken. You've become like us. It's the fate everybody has. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol. In other words, it's a place seemingly where there's no, there's no status. There's no pride. And the strains of your lutes. Worms are to be your bed, maggots your blanket. So in the prophecies, Isaiah, Ezekiel, we start to see the shift from the time of Saul, which is around 900. Now we're a couple hundred years later, and this concept has morphed. And you can see probably the beginnings of the morphing even in the Samuel Saul story. The concept has morphed to this place of judgment, punishment. Ezekiel prophesying against Egypt, mortal wail the dirge along with the women of the mighty nations over the masses of Egypt, accompanying their descent to the lowest part of the netherworld among those who have gone down into the pit. Now it's the pit. Now it's the netherworld. Now there are low parts. And you're starting to see some of the beginnings of what will be a Kabbalistic development of the concept of different worlds within Gehenna. Gehenna is going to be a word for not quite hell, but the place of punishment. It's based upon Ge Ben Hinnom. That's a valley where there was child sacrifice in Jerusalem. It shifts even more when we come to the wisdom literature, assuming that Job is a later book. It's a place of no return. It's a place where you can't reach God. If I must look forward to Sheol as my home and make the bed in the dark place, notice the dark place, say to the pit, you're my father, to the maggots, mother, sister. Where then is my hope? Who can see hope for me? Will it descend to Sheol? Will we go down together into the dust? It's by the time of wisdom literature, a place of nothingness. So it's interesting. It's really shifted in the course of the discussion. In wisdom literature, it's a place you don't want to go. For an intelligent man, the path of life leads upward in order to avoid Sheol below. And in the Psalms, it's also a place to avoid. But in the Psalm, it's a place over which God has control. There's no praise for you amongst the dead who can acclaim you. And then he says, so therefore, don't let me die. God will redeem my life from the clutches of Sheol. God will take care of me. The bonds of death encompassed me. The torments of Sheol overtook me. I came up, trouble and sorrow. I invoked the name Adonai. Adonai saved my life, and Adonai did. So the first concept that I wanted to share with you, after after the Mebu to the ground, is the concept of Sheol. And as we look at the development of this concept of Sheol, here's the statement I can make about the Bible. The Bible has a concept of something after this world. It could either be some type of netherworld, kind of a rudimentary belief, or it can be a place where there is punishment, and the concept developed. Developing parallel to it were two more concepts. So I want to pull them up, and then I want to create some room for questions and concepts. The concept is the concept of end of days, Messiah. And I didn't bring you all of those texts because I didn't want it to be a 10-page document. But know that in the book of Amos, the book of Jeremiah, the book of all of these prophetic books, there's a sense of there will be a time when Israel will be redeemed, when the Messiah will come and save us. And it weaves in a little bit with afterlife because it's a sense of a time ultimately of reward and restoration. And those pieces get woven in to what is the place of reward, woven into it as well as it is a time of justice, a time of peace. And so all of those different texts on end of days and Messiah are important as we weave the picture. The other piece that you start to see introduced in later prophetic books, this is around the 6th century BCE, is the concept of resurrection. The resurrection is primarily national resurrection, although there are a few brief references possibly to individual resurrection. There's this famous, crazy story of the valley of the dry bones in Ezekiel. God led Ezekiel around the bones. Can these bones live? He says, Adonai, only you know. Prophesy above them. Dry bones, hear the words of Adonai. Thus says Adonai to these bones, breath enters you, you shall live again. I'll lay sinews on you, I'll cover you with flesh, form with skin over you. I'll put breath into you, you shall live again. You shall know that I am Adonai. I prophesied as I've been commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was rattling. The bones came together. This is a freaky story. Bone matching bone. Prophesies as God commanded me. The earth, the breath entered them. They came to life. They stood up on their feet, a vast multitude. God said to me, mortal, these bones are the house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up. Our hope is gone. We are doomed. Prophesy therefore and say to them, thus says Adonai, eternal God, I'm going to open your graves, lift you out of your graves, O my people, and bring you to the land of Israel. You shall know that I am Adonai when I have opened your graves and lifted you out of them. If it had just been the dry bone story, I would say that this is a metaphor for national renewal and hope after a very hopeless time. The ending where it talks about lifting out of graves becomes the basis for many arguing in physical resurrection of the dead. By the way, you can certainly see, and we'll see it in a second, how Christianity came from Judaism. Let your dead revive, says Isaiah. Let corpses arise. Awake, shout for joy, you who dwell in the dust. Your dew is like the dew of the fresh growth. You make the land of the shades come to life. And then Daniel's a very late book. Daniel is probably 3rd, 4th century BCE. There'll be a time of trouble, the time of which has never been since the nation came into being. At that time, your people will be rescued. All who are found inscribed in the book. Many of those that sleep in the dust in the earth will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproach, to everlasting abhorrence. So we see in the latest of biblical books, the book of Daniel, a sense of reward and punishment that's connected to resurrection. So statement number 1, 30 minutes into class. The Bible presents us with the concept of Sheol. Later biblical prophecies present us with the concept of resurrection of the dead. that could only reference us as a nation, but could also create the groundwork for believing in personal resurrection, some life that continues after this world. That was an overview through biblical times. Let me take a second and see if there are questions and or comments. Phyllis asks, was there an alternative Sheol? Not that's presented there, not that's presented in the text itself. So it's interesting, is the punishment Sheol a place, or is death the punishment? The punishment seems to be the place. You in dying get sent to that place as a punishment. By the way, it does make sense that during dark times we see dark places as we start to try to figure out, where did this come about? How did it come about? What happens to the good people? In these texts, we read very little about them receiving any reward. You've developed, in terms of our literature, a place where there is punishment. And so it makes sense that the next stage of evolution is going to be an evolution where the good people do get reward. So again, Karen, your question was prescient. Although we do, I believe, have in the Daniel text a sense of judgment of good and bad, although we don't read what happens to the good. Is this connected to Christianity? Well, Christianity hasn't really developed yet. Is subsequent Jewish thought going to be a reflection of response to Christianity? The answer is absolutely, positively, yes. And I hope to have some interesting thoughts about how that developed. Other questions before we move on to post-biblical? We're moving fast. Go ahead, Ed. Unmute and talk loudly.
Several things. One, in terms of dust you shall return, was there any distinction in terms of the physical return, but not the return of the soul? That's one question.
Good. I actually think that dust you shall return is purely physical.
Okay.
You might be able to read that text and say, you know, I can read into it that maybe your soul goes someplace else. But the text in and of itself is about a physical return of body to the ground.
Okay, so that leaves open the whole question. What happens to the soul?
It absolutely leaves open. It makes no mention of soul. We don't see mention of soul till later literature. Till later literature.
Next question is, when you were talking about Sheol, made me think of the Greek concept of Hades, and also the notion of purgatory, which was this, both Hades and purgatory were sort of intermediate stages, sort of bit of limbo. You were in limbo.
Mm-hmm.
Wondering, was there over the years interpenetration of the Judaic notion of Sheol and the notion of Hades? And I guess, I don't know when purgatory actually comes on the scene.
Good. Purgatory is going to enter rabbinic Judaism. And it's going to be fascinating because, you know, I would have never ever guessed that even when I started rabbinical school. So you're going to see a text with purgatory. Sheol, though, is simply the place that whatever you are in whatever form you are goes. There's not a sense of you will then ascend. At least we don't read that in the Bible. It develops later. And so one of, for me, the most interesting things in preparing this class was watching the development of ideas. And many ideas that we kind of associate with afterlife were not part of the beginnings, the antecedents to that. So far, all we've really seen are the antecedents. Sheol, if it were like purgatory or Hades, then it would be a, here's how you get to the next level. But we don't see that yet. You're going to see it later.
So is there interpenetration in just one direction or going back and forth in terms of the concept of Hades and later on the concept of purgatory infused Jewish thinking about?
It's going to infuse Jewish thinking a little bit later, but it doesn't infuse it when it comes to these early biblical concepts. I'm looking at some of the other questions. We're going to come to what Linda's comment, and we're going to see that one of the most interesting things in terms of Jewish thought is there are so many different thoughts about this topic, which for me is a statement in and of itself. And it allows you to find your own place in the spectrum of Jewish ideas. So Linda asked about, that sense of coming back in other forms because you have unfinished work. Kabbalistic Judaism has a definite sense of reincarnation. So I'm not going to bring you any of those texts, but I'm going to reference that to you. So the answer is 1, I'm going to bring you a text in a second about the ability to elevate yourself, which isn't necessarily the ability to reincarnate yourself. And I will bring you also texts about reincarnation. We must jump back into the texts. So the Bible closes around 200 BCE, 250, 300. There's a period of time that there's not a ton of literature from, but we have what's called the Apocrypha, certain books that didn't make it into the canon, and also something called, there's a big long word, the Pseudepigrapha. And so from around 200 BCE to 200 CE, we actually start to see the concept of afterlife develop in a more complex way. Sheol becomes a realm with distinct areas for righteous and wicked. And that's going to develop even a little bit more. A dualistic concept of afterlife develops, with Sheol and Gehenna being the place for the wicked, paradise or Gan Eden or Olam Haba being the destination for the righteous. I don't know if you've heard of these books, the Book of Enoch, other Apocrypha books. What is happening during this time that might have driven that? So my teacher, in terms of this particular development, says, what was happening at this time was the time of the Maccabees. And during the Maccabean times, there was a bunch of martyrdom where people would die for their faith. And the second you have dying for your faith, you see very rapidly developing the concept of reward for that action of martyrdom. So it's beginning with this not apocryphal, that's different, the apocryphal literature, the Apocrypha, that we start to see the concepts developing. And in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, it flowers and flourishes with the beginning of rabbinic Judaism. 1st, 2nd century. Is this a response to the Romans? Absolutely. Is it a response to the devastation that happens with the destruction of temple? 100%. Because anytime you have all of these good people who are dying, you're going to have a dissonance with a good and powerful God. And we start to see the concept of world to come developing. In one of the most interesting and important texts, we have Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish military general who was in the Galilee and was taken captive. And he becomes, some would say turncoat, but others would say the Jewish scribe who writes the Jewish wars and actually defends the Jews. And we've actually found that his history is very, very, very accurate. So he writes that at the time of the temple, this is in the 1st century, there were Pharisees and Sadducees. We know those terms from the New Testament. The Pharisees get a very bad rap in the New Testament. The Sadducees were probably the descendants of the priests. And it tells us that the Sadducees rejected the concept of afterlife. They said there's no reward or punishment, there's no bodily resurrection. So for those of you who don't buy it, you can say, you know what? There was a big group amongst Jewish life, the Sadducees, who also rejected it. And it would make sense coming from a tradition that says you return to the dust, that comes from a tradition that says we serve God in this world. The Sadducees rejected afterlife. And Josephus says, as opposed to that, the Pharisees believed that the souls have immortality and there is resurrection. And reading now, the Pharisees are really the rabbis, the sages, starting to read the early rabbinic writings and seeing how it developed, for me, is fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. So all of these ideas that people have been throwing around a little bit, we're going to start to see. So if there's a belief in the world to come, look at this interesting text. This is a text that I'm going to stop after this one and get comments on these Pirkei Avot texts, because to me they're fascinating. Because they present a juxtaposition. And the juxtaposition and the tension is the tension between saying it's all about this world and the mitzvot we do in this world and the actions we do. Nope, it's all about the world to come. And the two sit in opposition and in contrast and in tension. And the rabbis hold on to both sides of the tension. Look at this text. Better is 1 hour of life in the world to come than the whole of life in this world. If I just stopped the sentence here, I'd say, whoa, the world to come is very important and I need to do anything I can to get there. Look at the very next sentence. Better is 1 hour and repentance in this world than a whole life in the world to come. In other words, it seems to minimize the world to come by creating meaning and purpose in this world through repentance and good works. Look at this next one. In the world to come, this says, by the way, this is the beginning of not just a place where there's reward and punishment, but the concept of judgment. In the world to come, you'll have to give account and reckon before the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One. In Rabbinic Judaism, we start to see the concept of judgment. And at the exact same time, they use that concept in order to motivate behavior in this world. Next one, Rabbi Jacob, who's an interesting rabbi here. This world is like a lobby, an antechamber for the world to come. In other words, this world is just preparing us for the next world. Prepare yourself for the antechamber, so you'll be prepared to enter the banquet. In other words, it's going to be good in the world to come. Wait till you start to see some of the descriptions I'm going to give you of what happens in the world to come. It's going to be good. And so the tension of this world, but there is a world to come. And this next one, I think, reveals where the rabbinic development of this concept came from. The reward for mitzvot is not given in this world, but in the world to come. I think that the rabbis were struggling with injustice, with the fact that bad things happen to good people. And the response to that bad things happening is there's a world to come. Is that a creation of their own mind to resolve the tension so that they can keep a God who is good, powerful, and all-knowing? Maybe. But it's one that they coalesced around to make sense of this world. Rabbi Jacob in Kiddushin 39b, it's a page that I would love you to read because it struggles with evil. In the Bible, it says that if you shoo the mother bird, you will have a long life before taking the fledgling. And another one says, if you honor your parents, you will have a long life. So the story in the Talmud is that the little boy was climbing the ladder to shoo the mother bird to take the egg because his father told him to, and he fell and died. Those of you who've read the book As a Driven Leaf, read that that's the story that caused Elisha ben Abuya to lose his faith. So Rabbi Jacob looks at all of the terrible things that happen to good people and says, well, here's how I resolve that. Reward is in the world to come. So we start to see the beginnings of Olam Haba, when divine judgment is rendered. And then we're also going to see in a second, many brought back to physical life. And then we're going to see texts that talk about who's denied a place in the world to come. All of them focus on ethical behavior as the requirement to get to the world to come. What is it? For many, it's an improved version of this world. For others, it's a totally different world. So here's what I have to say. I've presented you with a lack of clarity in terms of what is it that gets you there. I've given you a broad category. If you're going to get there, it is good deeds, that there is some type of judgment. But notice very quickly how Judaism starts to diverge from Christianity. The power of Christianity is that it promises eternal life. It promises afterlife. It promises salvation. God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. Whoever believed in him would have eternal life. John 3:16. And the criteria for eternal life is belief. The Judaism that we're starting to see emerge is a Judaism that demands behavior is the criteria for entrance into the world to come. We're going to look at who gets there and who doesn't get there. We're going to look at what it is. I promise you that. But let me take a few minutes and take some questions. So Judaism rejects, but I don't know that Judaism would reject Jesus being resurrected. It would hold that people could be resurrected. It would reject that Jesus is the only way to have salvation. So that's a whole nother question. And then what do we do with resurrection? That's a whole nother question as well. That would be an interesting question to have. Read James Carroll's book, because I really, Constantine's Sword. Is that it? It really develops what that nation is. When did the Muslims develop their idea of reward and punishment? Islam is very, very late. Islam is 6th, 7th century CE, Common Era. And so they really took from Judaism and Christianity and came up with a very, very, very specific sense. By the way, similar to Judaism in terms of certain acts being required. Your last dog. Okay, that was a private comment. There's a lot of people with interesting thoughts about this. And I know that I'm not going to have enough time to entertain those thoughts and to allow us to share them all, but it's an important thing because this is a personal issue that touches us in deep ways. Questions or thoughts in terms of the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism that starts to assert there is a world to come. It's based on what you do. It helps us understand evil in the world by saying there will be reward. By the way, those are concepts that ring with me. Questions or comments? Lori.
Rabbi, what a great class. So I'm just wondering, can you talk for a second about how the process and thinking between Yom Kippur and when judgment and the book is sealed and judgments are made, and maybe the judgment that happens, deciding who goes to Olam Haba and where and how high?
Yeah. You know, on a certain level, I guess the only thing I'd say for now is that the tension that was brought up in the text that I first brought from Pirkei Avot, that says better is, an hour of life in the world to come than everything here. In other words, you want to be able to feel like you are right with God. But getting right with God requires you to act in this world. So the only thing that I would say is that Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, and the high holidays are meant to focus us on our behavior. Whether that is to get us right with God for the world to come, some people, that's a good motivation. Whether it's getting us right because that's the thing that we want to do, that's another good motivation. But the next one, better is an hour of repentance and good works in this world. It's almost saying I want to pull people back from worlds to come, because it's all about this world. And here's this is my, I don't know how deep a suggestion this is. A deep piece of my faith is that I don't read these texts all that literally, because I think what they're trying to do is ask us to look at our behavior right now.
So just a quick follow-up question
Yeah.
on that. So do you think tshuva is possible once you've died? Heavy.
If there is a symbiosis between this world and the world to come, then prayers for a person who has died are something that could impact them. And we're going to see in a brief moment that the longest a person could stay, now we're going to get to Ed's point about some type of purgatory, which is what Gehenna turns into. The reason that you say Kaddish for a year is you're praying for the soul of your loved one to ascend. So might there be the intervention through loved ones via prayer that can help someone be forgiven? That is a concept in Judaism. This is good stuff. Good stuff. The rabbinic period develops the concept of judgment, collective and individual, in the time to come. Gehenna is either the realm of punishment or a place for purification. So we start to see in rabbinic texts this concept of a place for purification, what we would call purgatory. Rarely, and this is rarely, is it seen as a place of eternal damnation. I used to always say with great, great joy, Judaism does not believe in eternal damnation and other religions do, and I'm proud that we don't. But there are a few texts that say, for this you will be eternally damned. And then there's pushback. So here's my next piece. The fact that there is such uncertainty about every single one of the details of these questions shows that we just don't know. And were I to give you a theology, it would be a theology of humility and uncertainty, reflecting the human need to search for the best answer that you could possibly posit based upon your concept of what makes sense. And the fact that the rabbis are going to let texts sit next to each other that utterly contradict one another is a statement in and of itself. Did people follow that? Because that, to me, that's really, really important. The rabbis try to find a lot of, let me use interpretation to show you that there's a world to come. There's a whole page of Talmud with 20 different answers. Honestly, none of them are great because you just can't really know. I love the texts that develop, here's what the reward is, because I'd love to feel that that's what might happen. But I also love it because what it does is it highlights the behavior that's important in this world. So let's take a look at it. This is text number 1, and then I'm going to bring you its contradiction. Text number 1, what happens in the world to come? There's no eating, drinking, procreation, business dealing, jealousy, hate, competition. The righteous people sit with crowns on their head and enjoy the splendor of the divine presence. So my question to you is, what are the rabbis seeing as ideal? What are they seeing as that which pulls you away from the godly path? In other words, I think there are things on this list which there are things in common between them. So what does eating, drinking, sexuality, business, jealousy, hate, competition, what do those have in common? Send me chats on that one. I'm curious as to, we're not going to do those things. In other words, my first suggestion, I think there's more to it, is that those pieces that are pulls to do that which is wrong are going to be gone. Our Yetzer Ra is going to be gone. Our needless hurting of one another is going to be gone. And what are we going to do? We're going to sit in the divine presence. We're going to feel that which is beyond. That's a powerful statement. I mean, we've got to take this text apart a little bit. By the way, I can only teach this text in juxtaposition with the next text. In the world to come, the righteous will feast on the meat of the sea monster Leviathan. Apparently, there were these primordial sea monsters, Leviathan and Behemoth. God killed them and put Leviathan aside for the reward for the righteous in the world to come. I want to be in the world. I want to be in the room where they're eating. But maybe a little divine splendor is not a bad thing. But what's fascinating to me is that the Talmud allows both of these points of view to sit next to each other. And maybe what it's trying to do is teach us what is the good world. What is the good world? Self-indulgence, Brad says, is that which pulls them together. They're not godly. They separate us from God. Yetzer Ra, says Yesh. All those things that pull us from who we are. Harry writes, it's almost like the Buddhist sitting. That sense of just be present. By the way, there's something powerful about being present and say that's what you do in the world to come. That to me is incredible, and you become in touch with your divine essence. And there's part of me that when I first read this text, is like, oh God, sitting in divine presence. But now that I'm someone who meditates and somebody who, by quieting myself, by getting rid of those pieces of Yetzer Hara, comes to be connected to that which sometimes feels beyond, Harriet's answer really, really, really resonates with me, takes away focus. It brings you focus on divine presence. Karov, writes Robin. There's a sense of that, those things, greed might weave all of these things together. You do these things with other people, but when you sit with the divine presence, you sit alone. It's interesting that you're alone. You're alone in the most powerful of ways. You're alone in a peaceful way. And I actually think that this is a text, and I don't think I'm going too far here in saying the power of a spiritual response to what we're going through right now is the power of learning to be alone in a holy, meaningful way that connects you. These are all things about choice. Good. It's an interesting text. We'll have more to talk about it. Nobody else is joining me in the room with eating the delicious meat. Look what Rabbi Nachman says. Scholars who wrinkle their forehead because of the study of law in this world, and they're really concentrating. God's going to reveal mysteries in the world to come. It's interesting. He's more in the intellectual pursuit of what is Judaism as opposed to just sit with the presence. I like Rabbi Nachman. This is all in the Talmud. Some say in the world to come, all the animals which are unclean, God will declare them clean. In other words, it's a place where we're going to start to do away with rules. And you can almost hear the rabbis talking. Maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Is they're trying to define what is the ultimate good that they are searching for. And it becomes a really powerful, not intellectual exercise, but spiritual exercise. And were we to have time, we'd sit with the question, what would Olam Haba be for us? Do any of these texts touch us? So in your notes of questions, which of these texts most resonate with you in terms of what Olam Haba can and should be? Look at this next one. Whoever God has smitten in this world is healed in the world to come. The blind, the lame, and the deaf. Might the world to come be a place of wholeness, a place of recovery. And then for me, the spirituality is, how do I build towards the world to come? When God confused the speech of the builders of the Tower of Babel, God said, in this world, by reason of their evil inclination, my creatures are at variance. They're divided into 70 tongues. In the world to come, they'll all speak the same language. This one really resonated with me. In the world to come, there is a true unity of people. That which divides us is taken away. In the world to come, one will bring a single grape into a wagon or a ship and draw from it enough wine to fill a large barrel. Do you note the tension between some who describe world to come as a place of plenty when it comes to that which is physical, food, those types of things, and others who say, no, it's just a place of spirit? And once again, I want to use the word that I shared earlier. There is a humility that comes through not having certitude. And so, yes, Yeshua Leviathan is Malawach. He's absolutely right. Robin wrote something really beautiful. The Rav Nachman is the mysteries of the world will be revealed. Maybe those are some of the mysteries that are connected to family and love and connectedness. So what do you do with the lack of clarity around what is the world to come? And if there's a lack of clarity around what is the world to come, there is an even larger lack of clarity around what is Gehenna and who goes there and why. So I want to look at those texts, and then I want to spend a few minutes just reflecting on the fact that rabbinic texts, for all that they assert world to come, have no clarity as to what exactly it is, or on a certain level, exactly how to get there. Let's take a look. We have learned that the judgment upon the wicked in Gehenna lasts 12 months. That was the text I always knew. Only 12 months, we didn't have eternal damnation. Rabbi Eliezer asked Rabbi Joshua, what should a person do to escape the judgment of Gehenna? So this is Ed's question. How do we get from purgatory into the world to come? He replied, let him occupy himself with good deeds. Or how do I avoid purgatory? And so this says, you all have a chance to get to the world to come through doing good deeds. That to me is an interesting theology and philosophy. You elevate yourself to the world to come through good deeds. Look at Rabbi Eliezer's conclusion. If that's so, then the nations can do good and pious deeds and escape the judgment of Gehenna. One of the things that I love about most Jewish philosophies regarding this topic is that it applies to Jews and non-Jews. In Sanhedrin 90b, it says non-Jews have a place in the world to come. In Maimonides, who's much later, he says by doing the basic laws of goodness, the 7 laws of Noah, every non-Jew has a place in the world to come. Here's where it gets more interesting. Shammai and Hillel arguing, 2nd century. On the day of judgment, so now we've introduced this day of judgment, there are 3 classes. There's the righteous, they go straight to Gan Eden, paradise. The wicked, they go straight to punishment. Those in the middle. The righteous are inscribed for a perfect life. They go to the world to come. The evil are sealed for Gehenna. Those in the middle descend to Gehenna and cry out. They're judged there for 12 months. Now you all know why you say Kaddish for a year. You're actually praying for your loved one. And so Lori's question actually really is answered in this text. Now look at, you might, if we were people who had catechism that had a singular set of rules, we would just say, this is what the deal is when it comes to afterlife. But Beit Hillel utterly disagrees. Says, no, those in the middle go straight to Olam Haba. Much more lenient. But then they both agree, heretics, informers, those who reject the law are judged there for generation to generation in Gehenna. In other words, there are some things which are irredeemable. And then they're going to disagree on irredeemable. Rav Hanina taught all who go to Gehenna will come up again. In other words, everyone who is died, to Lori's question, has a chance to be redeemed, except for 3. The adulterer, the one who shames another in public. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. Then the one who calls another an embarrassing nickname. And you read that and you say, so many of us have done that. And you start to wonder, and you come to the conclusion, at least I have, that they're using this to teach us about behavior in this world. Don't shame one in public. Don't embarrass someone. Then they deal with, here are the people who have no place in the world to come. one who says there's no reference to resurrection of the dead in the Torah. That's an interesting comment. You can almost hear the rabbis debating the Sadducees, the Essenes, others who denied it, who said, we don't believe it. And said, no, it's so important that if you deny it, you won't get to have it, which is a pretty funny thing. You don't believe it, you're not going to get it anyways, even if it exists. If they say Torah's not from heaven, they're an apikoros, they're an apostate. Rabbi Akiva says, also one who reads external books. He lived at a time where that was dangerous. By the way, again, the book has a driven leaf. Or who incants over a word. In other words, someone who turns Judaism into magic. Abba Shaul says, also one who pronounces the divine name according to its letters. There's things you don't do. 3 kings and 4 commoners have no place in the world to come. If we had more time, we'd talk about these guys. Jeroboam, Ahab, and Menashe, they are terrible idolaters. Rabbi Judah says, no, Menashe has a place in the world to come because he asked for forgiveness. The commoners are Bilam, Doeg, Achitophel, and Gehazi. Again, whole nother class. Others say they do have a place in the world to come. So what interests me is that there's no clarity as to what the criteria is. And I want to ask you how you explain that. One way to explain that would be that I can find a place where I can kind of put my hat. I'm going to go with, Rabbi Akiva. Another one can say this becomes a way where we can talk about what's the most important and the most dangerous things in society that would merit either being or not being in the world to come. Good acts prevent her grandmother turning over in the grave. By the way, many of us have heard that, haven't we? If doing good creates godliness in the space between us, that's motivation for Phyllis. By the way, I think that that's what these texts are after. I think in many ways they use the world to come to teach about this world. Not just fear of retribution in the afterlife that makes you moral. It's passed on. Good. Those of us who need a little bit more motivation. Good. There isn't one answer. It helps us not lose our faith. We can find our own truths, right, Suzanne? Suzanne Gruber has a way of distilling everything into something very wise, always. And Suzanne says, Rabbi, you've brought us all of these contradictory texts. The power of a contradictory text is you get to find your own truths. And even if that truth is, this is simply a construct that is meant to teach us about what is good in this world. And for all that I began with an assertion of I believe in world to come, I also believe that many of the texts about worlds to come are meant to teach us about this world, about that which is dangerous. And I wish I wasn't, on a certain level, we need to kind of sit with each one of these things, and say, why is that dangerous? Why did that happen then? The heretics, the informer, the one who kind of rejects, the one who says it's not mine, the one who crosses certain boundaries. There's a danger in these texts. And the danger in these texts is it leads you to start to label people according to the negative behaviors. Some of the worst moments in Jewish history are moments when we have banned those who did not conform to the orthodoxy. People like Spinoza and or Maimonides. And so I both find these texts uplifting. I find the exercise of saying, what is it that would keep you from worlds to come important? I also find it a little bit dangerous. I want to lift up all of those things. There are many texts that to me are so interesting because they're clearly using world to come to teach about this world. So look at this next one. This is a text many of you have learned from me. In the hour when the individual is brought to the heavenly court for judgment, they are asked 4 questions. Were you honest in business? Did you set aside time for Torah? Did you work at having kids? Did you look forward to the world's redemption? Those are interesting questions that to me are the basis of a good life. So they use world to come to teach honesty, to say engage in learning what goodness is. By the way, it doesn't say, did you have kids? Did you work? That might even be a teacher or someone who connects with the kid. Did you look forward to world's redemption? Did you live with hope? The following activities for which a person is rewarded in this world and again in the world to come: honoring parents, deeds of loving kindness, making peace between fellow humans. The study of Torah is based on them all. That's in our prayer book every morning. Love this next one. This is in the Talmud. In the future world, a person will have to give an accounting for every good thing his or her eyes saw, but they did not eat. They didn't do. And someone mentioned at the very beginning, this is in the prayer book, and it is. You know, Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, you sustain the living with kindness. Mechayim Eitim Berachamim Rabim, with great mercy you lift the dead.
Yeah.
So the rabbis took these concepts and they wove it into the prayer book. Now, you should know that the Reform movement has actually shifted that line because they're so uncomfortable with the concept of resurrection. They say, we don't believe it, so we're not going to say it. I, by the way, when I said I don't think I believe this, would look at it in a metaphoric way, giving dead could be someone who is sick, who is depressed, who is, you know, and so we give them life through our support of them. But might it be that we can assert a God who gives life to the dead? You support the fallen, heal the ailing, free the fettered. You keep your faith with those who sleep in the dust. By the way, you can also read that in a way that says God keeps faith with those in dust through how we keep them alive through our acts. You are the master of life and death and deliverance. You are faithful in giving life to the dead. That's quite a statement. Yigdal, Maimonides, 13 principles. God will revive the dead with God's great love. The memorial prayer, El Merachamim, give perfect peace under the sheltering of your wings to our beloved who's gone to his or her eternal home. So when you're editing up to the last minute, you make typos. May their soul rest in the Garden of Eden. So the prayer of memorial is the prayer that connects us to our loved ones. Medieval philosophy develops this further, and I'm sorry for rushing through this, but I want you to see that the concepts from the Talmud don't stay static. Maimonides did something fascinating. He says hell isn't torment, but it's that the wicked soul is actually annihilated. They feel no pain. They pass out of existence, so they can't enjoy the bliss reserved for the good. And what does he say the world to come is? Well, this is a guy who treasured the intellect. No bodies, souls. We haven't delved deep enough into soul, but know that the concept of soul exists. Soul, the righteous, like angels. We have no bodies. Nothing occurs in the world to come which involves body. We're not sitting, standing, sleeping. Should be eating. We're not sad. We're not laughing. What does they mean when they say they'll enjoy the splendor of the divine presence? The righteous will attain knowledge and realization of the truth concerning God, which they didn't know in this world. It in many ways, that deep concept of that's in Buddhism as well. You sit and you come to deeper understanding. And look what he says. He says, don't suppose that in messianic days, any of the laws of nature will cease to exist, or that some new creation will then come into being with the created universe. The world will continue its normal course without change. What is in Isaiah? The wolf will lie down with the lamb and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. That's figurative. We create a world of peace. Someone had mentioned, and it had to be written, there's a Kabbalistic concept of reincarnation. There are all kinds of apocalyptic texts that are a whole nother series of classes. The war of Gog and Magog, you know, things like that. For me, those are ones that don't speak to me in the same way. I felt like I needed to bring this next piece, especially since we've been talking about afterlife and judgment. I love Leviticus Rabbah that says we don't erect monuments to the righteous, their deeds are their monuments. Might it be that afterlife is really the deeds of our loved ones? I love this text. I love this text. Here's another one of what will God ask me? Shimshon Raphael Hirsch surprised his disciples one day when he insisted on traveling to Switzerland. When I stand before the Almighty, I'll be held answerable to many questions. What will I say when? And I'm sure I will. Shimshon, did you see my Alps? In other words, subsequent generations of rabbinic leadership used the concept of what will you be held accountable for to expand the notion of what is important in this world. And I wonder what else should be on that list. So those of you who are still writing questions of reflection, what else should be on this list? And this next one is one of my favorite texts of all time. Rav Zushia is crying on his deathbed. Why are you crying? He says, you know, when I die, God's not going to ask me why you're not like Moses. Why were you not like Jeremiah? Why were you not like Akiva? All of those people. God will say, why were you not like Zushia? And that sense of what is it that God wants and we're held accountable for integrity to who we are. And so the concept of worlds to come is used to teach us about character traits and behavior in this world. I'm going to end with three thinkers, very, very different. One is Bernard Raskus, a rabbi from the 50s. What is the immortality in which I believe? I believe that a person lives on in his or her family. I believe there's a form of immortality in the institutions we build and the causes we espouse. I believe in the immortality of friendship and helpfulness. I believe in the immortality of existence. I find immortality in my people. Lou Greenberg wrote, I believe in an afterlife because I must. For me, as for many other people, the idea of an afterlife serves a cosmic need. There's just simply so much injustice. There has to be something else beyond this moment in time. In other words, that which rewards those who are righteous and punishes those who are evil. Neil Gilman was my professor. He wrote an interesting book called The Death of Death. The other book that I'd recommend you is What Happens After I Die. And that's where I pulled Blue Greenberg's. Neil Gilman says, I do not ignore, deny, or sidestep my critical faculties. I acknowledge their legitimacy and power. It takes me beyond their reach. It's what makes me, he's talking about belief in afterlife. It's what makes it possible for me to hope that my life here on earth is not my entire destiny. Mm-hmm. That to me is a really powerful line. That kind of hope takes me beyond the conclusion of my rational self. It refuses to surrender to the charges of denial and wishful thinking. It comes from some other dimension of my being, from that intuitive sense that I form a part of a broader order of existence that lends my life coherence. Or to use another terminology, I reclaim my myth, precisely as myth, broke perhaps, but still very much alive, and I revel in its power. At that moment, I recite the prayer in the Amidah and praise the goodness and majesty of God who gives life to the dead. So, wow, I'm going to take a deep breath. We made it through that. Here's what I hope you got out of tonight. What I hope you got out of tonight is that Judaism has a rich, rich, rich array of viewpoints about afterlife. And I think we do a disservice when we ignore them. And it could range from, you know, you live on through the legacy that you leave with your loved ones and the lessons you teach. It could be that you return to the ground from where you came. It could be that there's a soul, some part of you and your essence that survives somehow in some form. It could be that there's a connection to loved ones that you might have the possibility to engage with. It could be that there's a sense of judgment and reward and punishment. It could be that it is a motivator for deeds. It could be that in emphasizing the deeds you do, it prepares you for the world that will come. And I will end by saying I find all of those ideas compelling, compelling, compelling. So Do Jews believe in angels that protect us and our loved ones? Some Jews do. Mainstream Judaism doesn't. What about was written on Jewish gravestones about a soul being bound up into eternal life? Thank you, Stephanie, because we hadn't mentioned it. It is so fascinating that on the gravestone is the acronym Tehei Nishmato Tzura B'Tzora Chaim, may his soul be bound up in the bond of life eternal. There is an affirmation of something beyond this world. And it's vague enough to allow you to interpret it in many, many, many ways. Now, could you come back again? Does Judaism believe in reincarnation? There are certain streams of Judaism that do, primarily Kabbalistic. I would say mainstream Judaism on the whole does not. But again, I want you to find your own place. Hebrew school is nothing like this. Thank you, Pamela. You know, we stumbled onto something that I think really worked, which was studying the basics in a deeper way. And for me, it's been really, really fun to do. Yeah, does that mean there was a prior life in Jewish belief? Some would say yes. Some would say yes. Questions, comments, if anyone wants to unmute with a question, that's fine too, now that we're on the full screen. Okay, so we have been trying, I think, as best we can to pivot thoughtfully given the world we live in. And that means offering classes like this. We're gonna, after the holidays, offer a Kabbalah class. We're gonna keep on doing some basic classes. If there are things that you might want to be learning about that we haven't done, just let me know. Give me a private note. Okay, everyone. This was fun. It was fun preparing. I will have this sent to everybody who was on the call today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was great.
Thank you
Have
so
a nice
much.
night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Always. Yeah.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you.
Rabbi Esme.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes, your co-op, Rabbi.
We're all
Thank
going
you.
to be.
Harriet, you have to tell me your
Thank you
story.
so much, Ken and I really appreciate it.
We're all going to paradise.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. It was fabulous.
Thank you.
Oh, one more thing.
Yes.
I'm going to do 18 forward lunges and 18 reverse lunges.
Nice. I'm loving getting everybody's commitments.
Stay healthy.
Thank you. I'm planning on it. Good to see you, Linda. Take care, Paula.
Thank you so much. This was great.
You're welcome. Goodbye. Bye, wonderful students.